Hi, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
This seat taken.
Hey, Kiernan.
How you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm living the dream. Thank you for asking. Very excited for the second installment of the Fred Plotkin trilogy.
Yeah, his interview process here at Out of Office is going well.
Very good. It's a long process, but we only hire the best. So we keep having the callbacks. And, for those who didn't listen to Fred Plotkin 1, first of all, you should go back and you should listen to it. Fred is an expert on Italian culture, cuisine, and opera. And he was one of the great pioneers of opening up Italian travel and wrote a hit book in the 1980s, which was based on the food of Italy. And then during the pandemic, he and friend of the podcast, frequent podcast guest, Rick Steves, collaborated on a book called Italy for Food Lovers. And that's what we've been digging into. So the first episode was really getting to know Fred, talking about how he grew into an Italian expert. And then in this interview, we're digging super deep into the history of Italian cuisine and spotlighting a bunch of different regions, including a number of really quite off the beaten path areas of Italy. I think we all think of Italy as, the over touristed, but that's because we're reading about Venice, right? But in fact, there are great regions that you just have to know where to go, what to look for, and especially what to eat. And that's what Fred lets us in on in this interview.
Well, I'm excited for this. I just started watching the new Netflix series Ripley.
Oh, yeah.
And the first episode is split between New York City and Naples and a little town that's like a 3-hour bus ride outside of Naples. And it's so beautiful. It's just like the coast of Italy is just incredible.
Yeah. Oh, and we talk extensively about that. And of course, Fred, when he first started going to Italy, it was a lot of regions quite off the beaten path. And I have to say, it was like really refreshing to hear his take on how much you can go and explore in these smaller towns and in the areas that, certainly the seaside is one of the more popular, but we talk quite a lot about getting up into northern Italy, into the Alps, where there's a lot of influence of Austria, Slovenia, Croatia. So really, really super interesting. And a bunch of food you're going to probably never have heard of or thought of as Italian.
Well, I know what I'm going to have for lunch today after this.
And Ryan, I also know. So the third installment that we're going to do is we're going to dig in just about the coffee culture and the wine culture of Italy. Honestly, I'm thinking of a full spinoff with Fred. I could just talk and listen to Fred forever.
We should do a coffee episode on Colombia too. I haven't gotten a chance to do some of the coffee tours, but
that's a great idea.
Yeah, I'll probably do that this fall. And even on my street, like across from my apartment, there are just like wild coffee just growing.
like the green fruit.
Exactly.
Wow.
Fruit. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So
you ever pluck one of those off and open it up?
When the security guards of the building is not looking, I have plucked one or two. I don't think he likes it though. He kind of glares at me. So
I just say, hey, I need a little boost this morning. And give him a little wink. I'm sure you're charming.
Yeah.
Well, Ryan, that of course,
so
this is the perfect lead-in to our reoccurring segment. Pretty new that we're just getting into the habit of it here, but we got to do the Judy alert. This is the segment where we find out where Ryan is so that his mother, Judy, has at least one touch point with her son to be able to get in touch with him in case of emergency. Because, Ryan's a little inconsistent on the outreach home.
It's actually a beautiful day here in Bogota.
Okay.
The sun is out, but I did spend the weekend in Baru, Colombia, which is about 10 miles out of Cartagena.
Yeah, I saw you were taking flights from Cartagena, complaining about having to walk to the plane.
Yeah, you have to walk to the plane.
Yeah, it's not a big deal. Listen, a little walking, Ryan, it ain't going to hurt you, all right?
I don't know that I was complaining. It was just, at JFK, they put you in a bus.
Okay. Making us walk to the plane. It's the making. It was that verb that you posted to Instagram that made it a complaint.
Well, the making was there was no alternative.
Well, you could have just said walking to the plane, but instead you said making us walk to the plane.
That's true. I was a little tired and just ready to get on the plane.
Poor baby. Well, we're all glad that you're back in Bogota. And you have any little weekend jaunts coming up anytime soon?
Yeah, I'm going to hit Medellin next weekend for the weekend. And
I feel like you're kind of in a triangle where you're hitting Medellin and Cartagena areas quite a lot. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, those are like the big three tourist towns. Cartagena is a much different place. It's not as like work friendly, but Medellin is it's a cool town. So going to spend the weekend in the mountains there, and then pretty soon I'm headed up to the old US of A. So
yes, I can't wait. We're gonna take our trip to Louisville and Mammoth Cave. Ryan and I recently debating there are two Lincoln sites. One is the birthplace, and one is like the log cabin home. And we're having some healthy debate about which one we want to tie in on our way to Mammoth. But that's for another episode.
Exactly.
So it's good. We've narrowed down the triangle. So Judy, if you need to get in touch with Ryan, Bogota now, and otherwise, he'll be in kind of the triangle of the three tourist cities. But Ryan, the Fred interview is fairly lengthy, much to the betterment, and we can really get in depth. So I'm super happy about that. But before we take off, I would love to talk about, we've got a few pretty glowing reviews here.
Yeah, thanks for everybody who's going on the old Apple podcast and leaving us those 5-star reviews. Some
very helpful, very helpful,
super helpful. 95 Awkward loves the podcast.
Now that is the name of an out of office listener right there.
Fair enough. And they call out the mural in the 20th century. They call out a mural in the downtown post office of Wilmington, North Carolina. We did an episode about this. We talked a bit about this project where they painted murals all over post offices, and it's cool. People are, looking to see, and visiting those post offices.
This is one of those great hidden treasures. And I've talked on the podcast before about a few different really off the beaten places that I look if I'm traveling to a city to make sure that I'm seeing everything special, because I just love that really obscure stuff, like stuff that doesn't even make it to Atlas Obscura. And checking out a listing of these classic 20th century murals that were done in post offices across the United States is one of the best things to do. And it was awesome to hear that awkward 95 Awkward was able to catch one in Wilmington, North Carolina, which I've never seen that one.
Yeah, no, that was very cool. Now, our next...
it'd be fun, 95 Awkward. If you post that up on Insta, tag us in. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, we'll share on the Insta if you post that 95.
And that's OOO Podcast, at OOO Podcast, like, ooh, podcast.
Now, the longest review that we've gotten is from our new friend, Jen Penoyer. Gave us a review. She loves the podcast. Talked a bit about Disney World, made us think that we should do a whole episode on Disney World, actually.
Yeah, it was really helpful to hear Jen say that she had gone through the kind of trajectory that I was going through of wanting to take a family to Disney, a lot of shock at sticker price. I'm willing to pay a lot for travel, but when it's getting up to where you could go on a European vacation, it starts to feel like maybe I'm going to lean that way. So Jen, super helpful. Glad you found it interesting. It sounds like you're still going to go, but I was thinking if this is something that we're hearing good feedback on, it'd be great to get a Disney travel expert on to talk about potential cost saving directions, but also why is the company pricing it so high?
Yeah, I wonder why that is. Probably Joe Biden's fault.
Oh, stop. No, I think that, you do see Disney because they were kind of late to the streaming game. And, I know some of the Marvel universe, the Star Wars universe, they haven't been blowing it out of the water lately. And so, I think that they're looking for a cash cow in the company, in Disney World. That's one place where the star hasn't faded.
Yeah, well, we should definitely do an episode. Also want to say that Jen's traveled a lot around LATAM and has been to Santiago, where I believe I'm going to go in December, which I'm super excited about. So look forward to that. And we've got a couple more reviews here. I just want to give a shout out to Ash Vega 03. And Ashvika03 really enjoys their interview segments as well as the Insert City 101 guides. So thank you for that. And then this is sort of funny. We've got New York City 125678. I don't want to get those numbers wrong. They say that we have a reverent humor that gives us an edge. So we're edgy and we're a bit nerdy, but 5 stars, loves the pod. Thank you so much. And also, we were called laid back in one of these reviews. Which
I've never been accused of being laid back, and I felt pretty good about it.
Yeah, it didn't stress me out at all. I'm like, why am I so laid back? So thank you so much for the reviews. Again, leave them anywhere you listen to the pod, but they're especially helpful over there on the Apple Podcast app. Helps new listeners find us, and you'll get a shout out on the pod. So it's a great deal, I think. So Kiernan, should we jump into this interview with Fred?
Absolutely. Why don't you? I feel like I did the full intro already. So let's get over to Italy and travel around with the expert in town, Fred Plotkin. Tell the cabin crew.
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
So Fred, we're back for part 2, potentially of 2, maybe of 3. And I just want to thank you for being back on Out of Office.
I'm happy to be here.
And for those listeners that didn't hear part 1, highly recommend that you go back, where we learn all about how Fred fell in love with Italy and became an expert in the cuisine and culture in part 1. And this in this episode, I want to really dig in on the region by region breakdown and to understand some of the forces that cause difference between different regions in Italy's food. And so I guess to begin, Fred, my question would be, so many Americans think, you hear an Italian restaurant and something comes to mind, pasta with red sauce, I guess. And, is that actually accurate, that there's some version of Italian food that crosses all of these regional lines? And if not, what are the major differences that you're seeing place to place?
Well, I imagine most of our listeners are in North America, and therefore their descendants, the people from whom they descended, rather, arrived mostly from places like Campania, which is Naples, Sicily, Puglia, the southern parts of Italy, where the tomato flourishes, although the tomato exists throughout Italy, and where dried pasta is from. In other words, spaghetti, macaroni, and so forth, because fresh pasta doesn't keep. And fresh pasta is made in places like Liguria, especially Emilia-Romagna, where they use egg. And therefore, it's a more expensive enterprise. But the food of the poor, which is not to say poor food, is rooted in things that have longer conservation. So dried pasta, which was invented south of Naples near Salerno and Amalfi, is something that can last for several months. So when the wheat is harvested, then you make your dried pasta. Therefore, you would have that with whatever the sea or the land provide. Tomatoes in Campania are abundant. And they tend not to cook that long sauce that we tend to think of, but they tend to chop up tomatoes, add a little bit of olive oil, maybe a few herbs, and have it fresh. The long sauce is when you have time. Remember, sauce requires energy, and I don't mean from the person making it, but the flame, the heat. If you're in Italy, once upon a time, they would have these little gas canisters. In the first home I lived in, I had to get il gas delivered all the time, and that was expensive. So therefore, you tended to make foods that were quicker, and the Sunday sauce would be something very special. And you'd make a lot of it, and you'd keep it for a day or so. But the main thing is be quick, cook quick, make it delicious, and make it nutritious, because there's work to be done. Doesn't mean you don't enjoy your food, but you use, and this is key for understanding all of Italy, what's known as la materia prima, primary materials. So you use the best tomato in season. You use the best lemon You use the best melon, whatever it is you're cooking with or making a dish with. You use, unless it's a preserved thing like prosciutto is a preserved food. It's the leg of a pig, the hind leg, preserved for 14 months with a little bit of salt and air. Prosciutto means from the verb prosciugare, to dry out at length. So all prosciutto is air-cured ham. It's not cooked, it's raw.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike prosciutto cotto, which is boiled ham, which is closer to what we think of as ham in the United States and Canada. But if you are visiting, say, Montreal or Toronto, you have communities from other parts of Italy. Montreal is mostly from Molise, a little region in the south that no one knows. And Toronto is mostly Friuli Venezia Giulia in the northeast. And the reason they went there is because the people of Friuli Venezia Giulia were and are loggers. There's a lot of wood that's used in that region. So when they migrated, they would not go, say, to New York City, where there's not a lot of forest. They went to Toronto because Ontario, that surrounds it, is full of wood. So there's a reason for everything. That's the wonderful thing about migration, about food studies and so on. Everything has a reason, and it's my great delight in life to try to learn what that is and share it with people who read my books and listen to what I say.
So across the full stretch of Italy, when you this focus on the best ingredient you can get your hands on, how much does that vary space to space? I mean, it is give a sense of the scale of Italy and how what you can get in one place might not be the best, and therefore dictates what recipes are being cooked at that time of year.
Well, Italy is the size of the state of New Mexico in the United States, which is the fifth largest state in America.
That's helpful context. I don't know that everyone knew that one.
Yeah. And New Mexico has about 2 million or a little more, and Italy has 60 million people. And therefore, the population density is many times greater. Italy, unlike New Mexico, is surrounded by water. Italy has Alps, foothills. It said that 2/3 of the Italian peninsula are hill or mountain. Therefore, you have places that are divided by mountains. So if you look down the central spine of Italy and you go from Milan down to Bologna, down to the Adriatic, that's mostly plain. But if you look at the map and look at Bologna to Florence, it looks very close. That's all mountains.
Right.
So it's not easy to get from one to the other. It was not in the past. Now there's a train through the mountains that takes you there in about 75 minutes. But even when I was a student in Bologna years ago, it took a longer time. And Florence was not around the corner. Now we have autostradas. People drive fast. If you drive, I don't drive. And therefore, they get to places quicker. But even with that, Italian cities, unlike most in America, don't allow cars in the city center because of pollution, because of protecting the precious monuments. So for that reason, many city centers you can't park. So you have to walk in. So to answer your question, I coined a term many years ago that Italians are culinary geographers. And by that, I mean they come to understand that particular soil, particular exposure to sun. Does the sun hit the north side of the mountain, the south side of the mountain? Where does the sun set? Is the soil sandy? Is the soil more fertile? All of that means that you can grow one crop in one place and another crop in another. If you need a lot of sun, for example, let's say for wine grapes, you would position your grapes and your grapevines in one direction. If you need something that requires more protection, then you position it on the other side. So I can tell you many, many food products around Italy that are known to be of a place. Most famously, pears from Ferrara, cantaloupe from Mantua, Mantova, cherries from a few towns. One of them is Vignola near Modena. There are a couple of others around the country. The apricots from near Naples, the peaches from a town called Volpedo, and on and on and on. I don't want to bore you with all that. But then imagine that you want to make cheese. and you have cows that graze in certain areas, what the cheese tastes like is based on what the cows eat. So if the cows eat hay, or if the cows graze in high alpine valleys and eat very herbaceous grass, or if the cows are fed a different kind of diet, that will change the flavor of the milk. The pigs that you feed, if you're going to make prosciutto, depends what they eat. It really depends. A lot of them eat acorns, among other things, because the old adage is, not only are you what you eat, but you are what the thing you eat eats. So if you really seriously, so that if your pig is a vegetarian, let's say, which it should be, or your cow is a vegetarian, you're being fed based on that. But if your cow or pig is being fed more corn instead of other products, say grass or seed, it tastes different. Similarly, all over the country, there are chickens, but depending where they live and depending on the breed of chicken, it tastes different. So there's a chicken from near Padova, that is a little more intense in flavor in a very delicious way. But if you were to take that same chicken and place it in Tuscany and feed it different things, you would perhaps cook it differently, perhaps a little more salt. And that's where all the variations happen, because let me get now to the whole story of salt. Salt was the most important currency of the Roman Empire. And the reason for that is that salt was used for food preservation. And so you have expressions like, this man is worth his weight in salt or gold. You paid someone a salary, that's salt. You made a salad, insalata, was where greens would be preserved in salt. You made salsa, in other words, salt that's preserved vegetables, not tomatoes, because they didn't exist in the Roman Empire. You made salsiccia, sausage, or salami. All of these words come from the use of pork for preservation, of salt for preservation of food. And I was saying before about spaghetti that you would dry it, but the Romans, if you look at where the Romans journeyed and they built roads, they tended to look for places that had a lot of salt. So Iberia, modern Spain, had a lot of salt. Places in North Africa, places in northwestern Sicily, but especially the Adriatic. And if you go to the city of Ancona, the capital of the Marche, there's a road that the Romans built from Ancona to Rome that's called the Via Salaria, the road of salt, because all the salt that was brought from the Adriatic and eastern parts of the empire came into Ancona and was transported overland to Rome. So that's why when you go to Rome now, to me at least, Roman cooking is saltier than many other cuisines in Italy, because it's a Roman gesture of showing of wealth and of generosity to cover something in salt. I'm not a big fan of salt. Salt announces itself in everything you eat, and salt is used for seasoning. That's okay. I would rather taste the potato and the oil than the salt. I would rather taste the meat than the salt, because food products innately, like milk, like meat, have salt in them. So I don't feel the need to add additional salt. And the place where I really diverge with Italians, they automatically assume that when you boil water for pasta, you have to throw in a pinch of salt before it returns to a boil. I don't do that. And everyone loves my pasta. But
yeah, I was just about to say, and you've talked about how well regarded your cooking is. That's quite incredible.
But especially my pasta. I wrote my first book was the pasta cookbook. Yes. But yes, I stintingly use salt in my sauces. I'm not saying I'd never use salt, but I don't want gratuitous salt that I'll put in my water. To me, it really does not make a difference. The Italians mostly say they love me, but that I'm insane on this topic, but I'll stick by that. Because really, we don't need extra salt in our diet. Americans so overdo it with the salt.
Yes.
And, we want to keep our blood pressure normal. I'd rather raise my blood pressure with espresso than salt, for example.
Well, I was thinking maybe for part 3, we save wine and espresso.
Absolutely.
Because I feel like that's going to need a conversation all its own.
I could do wine for days. I have done one.
That'll have to be a late night recording. We can each bring a glass.
Sure.
Another along the same lines of salt, something that I was enlightened by in your book was balsamic vinegar.
Yes.
And what stood out to me about the way you write about the history and regionality of true balsamic vinegar is how in the American food system, in the world of grocery stores and big box stores, you do have certain designations like balsamic vinegar that are being put on products that are very far away from the originals. So tell us that story. What is true balsamic vinegar?
Here we go. Well, actually, the word, I love that you say true, but actually the word is traditional.
Traditional.
And it's called aceto balsamico tradizionale. And Italy is divided, as you know, into 20 regions, but within these regions are provinces, which are like counties in America. And each county may have a capital city. In America, not so much. It'll be the big town. But in Italy, a provincia, a county, actually has a capital city, and which is not the capital of the region. It's just the capital of the place. So, for example, in Emilia-Romagna, there are numerous provincial capitals. Among them are Parma, Modena, Reggio Emilia, Bologna, Forlì, Rimini. I'm leaving out a couple, but the point is that these towns are all very close to one another. Parma and Reggio Emilia are 22 miles apart, and Bologna and Modena are 18 miles apart. So it's really like that. Mm-hmm. But there are vast differences, and the people are very proud and territorial about these differences in terms of what they can legally produce, that they can officially call something. So in Emilia-Romagna, only 2 provinces, Reggio Emilia and Modena, are allowed to produce what's called aceto balsamico tradizionale. And this is it goes back many centuries tradition, where you take Trebbiano grapes, these are white grapes, and you in effect turn them into vinegar, but then you put them into barrels for aging. And depending who you talk to, it should be 5 years, 12 years. I would tend to say 12 years, but they use 5 different barrels. And I always don't remember them all, but one of them is cherry wood, one of them is oak, and I can check it and tell you in a couple of minutes. But basically, there are 5 different barrels, and I'm finding the page in my book, Italy for Food Lovers, that I wrote with Rick Steves. And I'm not finding the 5 barrels, but take my word. And
there are 5.
But there are 5, and they're all of different sizes, because what happens is after a year in contact in a largish barrel with one wood, you then take what remains and you transfer it to the next wood in a slightly smaller barrel. So when you go into what's called the acetaia, the place where the vinegar is aged and made, it goes from a smaller barrel to a smaller one, to a smaller one, to a smaller one, to a smaller one. And as you do that, the aceto balsamico tradizionale becomes more intense, more rounded, more characteristic, more rich. And you don't never, ever use this as salad dressing. You don't pour it like vinegar. When it reaches a certain age, you use an eyedropper. And I will use 1 drop of it because it's so charismatic in a food that if I make, say, a Parmigiano risotto, I'll put in 1 or 2 drops and stir it, and the heat of the risotto will absorb and disperse the flavor of the aceto balsamico tradizionale. And it's very sexy. It's terrific. And I would use it on a strawberry. I would use it on a little bit of scrambled egg. Things like that, even on a tepid boiled potato, which may sound banal, but the potato becomes the staging area to really experience the aceto balsamico tradizionale. Now, a friend of mine was traveling recently in Italy, and he went to Modena, and he went by a store that is one of the 9 sellers, because there are only 9 producers of the traditional aceto balsamico. And he spotted a case of 6 bottles, which I think the thing cost $1,000, and noticed that my name and my signature had been copied and put on the 6 bottles. And apparently it was an homage, but no one told me.
Yeah, and they certainly didn't pay you.
No, they didn't pay me. And I'm honored. It's very nice that they would think enough of me that they would put my name on that. But, I can't imagine, because I'm not famous in Italy, at least not in the food world, that people would know that Fred Plotkin's signature, which doesn't sound very Italian, would mean something on Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale. But I contacted the producer, whose name is Giusti, and it's a wonderful producer. And I thanked him, and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I meant to tell you, but we wanted to honor 5 or 6 people we think very highly of, and you were one of them." And the point is, the people who do this do it with such care. And when there was an earthquake near Modena a few years ago, among the people I contacted first were the 9 producers of Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale, because if their barrels fell and broke, that's history. Mm-hmm. Because some of these barrels contain vinegar that's 70 or 100 years old, and you buy it in tiny, tiny amounts. Now, this is not for everyday consumption. Look at the word balsamic, balsam. It was originally intended as a medication. And in the Renaissance, when they didn't know as much about medicine or medications as we do now, it was found that it settled many things: gastric distress, sores in the mouth, things like that. And for example, if I do a lot of wine tasting or oil tasting and my mouth has had a workout, I will take 1 drop, and I mean 1 drop, of Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale, put it on my tongue and let that disperse, and my mouth is restored to normal. So it's not an everyday food product. Now, what is it that we buy in the supermarket for $7 in the States in a big bottle? That is red wine vinegar, sometimes with caramel color, to which they've added 1 or 2 drops of the real thing. And they call it balsamic vinegar. There's even a white version of white vinegar. Mm-hmm. Now, I cook with vinegar all the time. Vinegar is a wonderful thing. It's acidic. It tends to, for example, in the Northeast, they often take slices of ham, of pork, and they cook it in a pan, not in oil, but in a little bit of white or red vinegar, usually white. And the reason for that is that the vinegar flavors the ham, but also pulls out the fat. So it's not that it becomes dry, but the combination of the fat, the pork fat, and the vinegar is delicious. It's a terrific sauce, and no salt added, no spices added. Talk about a quick, easy dish. Slices of ham and white vinegar. That's it. And that's good cooking.
I do wonder, I mean, as a great Italian cook with only the food, I mean, granted, you're in New York City, so you're able to get more interesting and probably more authentic, more costly ingredients. Do you get frustrated by not having access to some of these foods stateside?
I don't get frustrated by the lack of the fancy ingredients. I get frustrated by the fact that if I go to my store here, I may not ever get a melon or an orange. Now, we have wonderful oranges in America, don't get me wrong, but they're different from Italian oranges. And if I want to cook something that tastes Sicilian, that has, it's called a tarocco, are these blood oranges that are not like the ones from California or Texas. They taste like raspberries. They look like little oranges, but they taste like raspberries. And if I'm going to make a sauce, let's say, and not necessarily just a dessert sauce, but let's say I want to flavor duck. And rather than use duck à l'orange the way the French would use, when I use this raspberry tasting orange, they often use raspberry vinegar with duck. I don't do that because the acidity comes in the orange, which is really purple red inside, but it tastes like raspberries. And that's what you can't find here. The wonderful variety of table grapes as opposed to wine grapes that Italy has is hard to find here. America is a magnificent country agriculturally, but we are a combination of mass delivery of mediocre products only to people who don't know to ask for better, with super expensive products that should never be that expensive because I want that everyone eat, and I don't want fancy food if the person next to me doesn't have food. I would rather give up half of my food budget, which is not big actually, and make sure someone else eats. And I'm going to now put in a little bit of a pitch. I went to a supermarket the other day and there was a migrant family standing outside. It was a mother and 3 little kids. And they were not asking for money. They just said, we are migrants. And people were dropping dollars on the ground in front of them, which I found insulting. But I went into the supermarket and budgeted $15 that I would spend and bought them so much food that the family could eat. And that the woman seemed astonished that she thought I spent $60, $70. I spent $14.79. And it gave them food. I got chocolates for the kids, but everything else was something that can build their bones and give them food for the night. That's how I think. And I really, when people talk to me about Italy and fancy food and so on, that's fine. But Italian culinary traditions, for the most part, is about poverty, about saving, about not wasting a thing. There's a wonderful expression near Parma that the music of Giuseppe Verdi is like a pig. Nothing goes to waste because you use everything from the snout to the tail because nothing should go to waste. And I agree with that. They use the trotters, they stuff it and they make that into a dish. The better parts, such as the hind legs and the fat back and so on, goes to more important food. But you have salamis, you have head cheese. Some people find that gross. But butchering, which began with the Romans butchering the pigs, was elevated to a high art. And everything the Italians do is a high art, even if it's for everyday consumption. And I know I'm evangelizing, but too bad.
Well,
I just want to say one thing. They develop beautiful knives specifically for all this butchering that they do. So that's why knives in Italy, they're famous in Germany and Japan, yes. But the knives that were created in Italy were not fancy, but they're intended for proper use in the kitchen. Yes, sir.
Well, to that point, I do just want to say for the record, because I know our listeners and they're going to want to know those 5 types of wood that go into the balsamic vinegar barrels. And I've got them here.
Good.
But you fact check this because you're the expert. I just found this on a Google.
Cherry, juniper, oak, and 2 more.
We got mulberry, and chestnut.
Cherry, juniper, oak, mulberry, chestnut. That's right.
And you did mention they get smaller each time. Is that because of evaporation one to the next?
Evaporation of the vinegar.
Yes.
So it's not, for example, that you always start with cherry. You start with with each year, whatever the big barrel is, you start with that. So therefore, from year to year, everything is different. Because let's assume that the Trebbiano grapes are more or less the same. But if you're starting with a juniper barrel that's big as opposed to an oak one, you are getting the initial sensation, the initial formulation is slightly different. But by the time it goes through a cycle of at least 12 years, it will have become a product that the person who makes it will be proud of, or he or she won't sell it.
So I would love to dive into 1 or 2 regions specifically. You mentioned on the last episode when you were beginning to look into writing a book and basically trying to find a region to specialize in. Liguria, the Italian Riviera, is where you settled. The great book hadn't been written yet. And forgive me if I don't know it, but one of the discoveries for me in Italy for food lovers was the region that I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, Friuli Venezia Giulia. You'll say
Friuli Venezia Giulia. I'll only talk about that if we can also talk about Liguria after.
You've got, you know what? Yeah, absolutely. We'll go to Liguria after.
Yes, definitely.
But you describe this in the book. You describe it as the great undiscovered region of Italy.
It is, And I wrote a whole book about that region called La Terra Fortunata, the Fortunate Land, the splendid food and wine of Friuli, Venezia, Giulia. And when I'm asked, as I'm inevitably asked, in opera, I'm asked who are the best of the three tenors, Pavarotti, Domingo, or Carreras. I always demur because I worked with all of them and they're all great. But when people say to me, what's the best food region of Italy and what's the best wine region of Italy, I then try to demur because all 20 are great. However, if I were to alphabetically say to you what I think the three top wine regions of Italy are, I would say Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, Piemonte, Piedmont, and Tuscany, Toscana. So those are the three wine regions. The three food regions are alphabetically Emilia-Romagna, Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, and Liguria. So therefore, only one region, Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, is in the top three in my consideration for food and for wine.
And can you begin by orienting us where in Italy is it?
Yes, you're the Northeast. So if you land at Venice Airport, get out and turn right. Turn left, you're in Venice. Right, you're in Friuli, Venezia, Giulia. Now, the name. Forum Iuli, Julius's Forum, Julius Caesar, because the ancient Romans conquered that area. And much of the area was forested hills or plains, plus some shoreline. There was a town there called Aquileia. Aquileia was one of the greatest towns of ancient Rome. It was sort of the northern port for the Roman Empire on the Adriatic. And it's where products landed from, but also landed in and went from down the Adriatic to Rome, often, as I said, via Ancona and across the Via Salaria. Now, there was wood there. There were beautiful forests. There was land that grew magnificent fruit. Cherries, plums, apricots were gorgeous there, among other things, but those big three especially. There was a lot of fruit in the area. There was a lot of vegetables. There was seafood. The Romans brought the pig there. And when they built the city of Trieste, and I'll explain what happened to Aquileia, Trieste became the capital of Venezia Giulia. Again, we're Julian, as in Julius Caesar. The Venezia part came later. Let me explain why now. When the Roman Empire fell, Attila the Huns attacked Aquileia and destroyed or attempted to destroy Aquileia, which had by then become a Christian town. It was unique because women had more rights than in most places. Women were administrators, they were teachers. It's not that they had equal rights as they should, but for 4th and 5th century BC, AD, they were doing pretty well. When the Huns attacked, the people of Aquileia quickly fled to 118 hostile barren islands in the northern Adriatic and created a new city, which was called Venice. One of the origins of the word is phoenix, as in rising from the ashes. So rising from the ashes of Aquileia came Fenice, Venice. The symbol of the opera house there is La Fenice, the phoenix. And these were the Aquileians who, in effect, built what we now consider Venice. That's for a whole other time. But the other thing to know is that a lot of these people had ancient Roman origin, not all of them. So they knew how to make wine. The grapes there were magnificent. They also knew how to use plants and flowers to make essences, whether for food or perfume. The early traditions of glassmaking was born in the sand around Aquileia and Grado and other towns near what became Venice. So if you have glass, if you have wine grapes, if you have perfume, you make bottles, you put things in bottles. Before that, the Romans used clay, they used amphorae, and it would crack. The bottles became more resilient. And so that was part of the tradition. That's why when we talk about Venetian blown glass, it actually was born from the Friulians, from the Aquileians. The intensity of culture there, and I don't mean performing arts, although it's there too, but practical living culture of survival is remarkable. And the people are, for the most, they're very industrious, but they're also rather humble. They always say that they're very shy and withdrawn until they get to know you. Their shyness, in my experience, lasts about 30 seconds. They're the most hyper hospitable, lovely, charming people. The men and women don't always get along, but that's true all over the world. But it's a place that traditionally, historically, has very strong, brave, intelligent women who, in Italian, you say si dà da fare. They give themselves something to do. They're very productive. They're the people who often run the businesses, the restaurants, make sure that the accounts are kept. Trieste itself became this fascinating city because the Austrian Empire, the Habsburgs, invaded in 1361, and they held it until 1918. So that means that Trieste was the port of the Austrian Empire, because I know you saw The Sound of Music, and didn't you wonder why Captain von Trapp, who lives in the Alps in Salzburg, is in the Austrian Navy? He was based in Trieste. And
gosh, you may not know, Ryan and I are both big Broadway fans, and I've never thought to ask myself.
Yeah, why is a Navy captain living in the Alps?
I just figured they needed the whistle for the children.
But this is what I mean, and I mean this very seriously. My approach to life is there are reasons for everything. And we just have to try to learn and study and ask politely, but ask firmly questions that give us knowledge. Knowledge is power, but then you share the power. You don't use the power for yourself. But once you do that, it's such a joyous thing to do that. So when I got to Trieste and I went to visit the pork plants, because that's where the Romans did a lot of their curing, in Trieste, one of the great food institutions of the world is called a buffet. And this is not a cafeteria. This is not a smorgasbord. It's what I call a pork bar. And if you're kosher, if you are halal, I'm sorry, cover your ears. But it's one of the greatest things in the world to go to a buffet in Trieste and point to what you want. And you can get a platter, either a little sandwich of one kind of pork or different samplings of different pork, and now with a boiled egg. Here, a little bit of what do we call them in English? Rooster, boiled rooster that has a very intense flavor with these different sauces that they serve, and a red wine, a very low alcohol red wine called Terano. And the grape goes back to ancient Rome. Terano is considered one of the healthiest beverages in the world and has led to a lot of studies about how heart disease remains lower in Trieste, despite the fact that they're eating all this pork and butter and so on. By the way, for reasons that I'm going to make you guess, more Viagra is sold in the province of Trieste than any province in Italy. Why is that?
Golly, no.
Because it borders on nations that don't sell Viagra, so everybody comes. It's not that there's a particular deficiency in Trieste.
No, but either way, they'd be getting it done. So, that's just by the modern world.
But, I've seen in pharmacies in Trieste have a sign outside, Viagra, abbiamo Viagra.
Well, at least they don't have packaging with your signature on it quite yet.
It's true. But the other thing is that there's a wonderful diversity of wine grapes in that region. And in Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, they have many, many, many ways of making wine. And here's the important takeaway. And here's what I learned there. Nowhere I've been to in the world, including the best places in France, is more sophisticated in terms of wine and food pairing. Because what they do there that to me was a revelation was, if you go to France, and I'm not knocking France, I love France and I love French wines, but if you go, say, to Bordeaux or to Burgundy, and you ask, how do you pair this wine? They'll say, with meat, with cheese, which is true. But in other words, the white with fish, the red with meat, that's not enough. What I learned at Friuli Venezia Giulia just completely blew my mind. You do not pair to the protein, you pair to the flavorings. So that if you're making codfish and it's flavored with one thing instead of another, you pair to that flavoring. And they have wines that are so wonderfully singular that each wine will go with a different thing. So in Friuli Venezia Giulia, you don't necessarily sit down at a table with 6 people and have a bottle of wine and then another the same, another the same. You agree on your course, and then you get a wine that's suitable to that course. So, for example, they do a wonderful veal stew with nutmeg, which may sound weird, but it's actually pretty wonderful. And they found that Cabernet Franc, not Cabernet Sauvignon, but Cabernet Franc, is the perfect pairing for veal with nutmeg, but especially anything with nutmeg. Sauvignon Blanc goes beautifully with white asparagus, which is a great specialty in the region every spring. And you can go from dish to dish, from food to food, and learn about these pairings. And it's phenomenal and endlessly gratifying. And anyone who wants to really learn about how to develop his or her palate and nose and sophistication, that's the place to go in the world, not just Italy.
To get into some of the more specific food stuffs of this region that might surprise folks as being a specialty in Italy, nutmeg jumped out at me. I'm from Connecticut, so nutmeg state. Immediately that sort of surprised me. But you mentioned many dishes that I think would be surprising until you look at a map and you realize, well, Austria's on one side. Slovenia is on the other side. And so when you get to your sweet section, for example, there's strudel. And so how much is that exchange, would you say, is that still happening? That, you've given a lot of the history of the region. Is there much travel between those countries today? And do they still inform the development of food as it evolves in time?
Well, politics through the centuries has been fraught with all kinds of battles. World War I, we don't associate that much with Italy, but one of the major frontiers of the First World War was the northeastern part of Italy, Friuli Venezia Giulia. It's still known as La Grande Guerra, the Great War, not because it was great, but because it was massive. And so much of it was fought in that area. And there's a town called Oslavia that has an ossuary, which is basically this massive and very tragic place where the bones of thousands and thousands of soldiers, be they of the Austrian German side, be they of the allies of Italy, France, and Great Britain and the United States, they all died there. If you read your Ernest Hemingway, he fought in World War I in that part of the world, in the Veneto, but also in Friuli. When he wrote about Gertrude Stein, who he met in Paris, I hope you've read A Movable Feast, which is really one of the first books that I read about food. He said that Gertrude Stein had the face of a Friulian woman. And no one knew what that meant unless you were in Friuli. But what he meant was these strong, solid, positive, immovable until they want to be moved kind of women who do great things with great courage and without calling attention to themselves. There were women who in the First World War in that part of Italy would climb up to the Alps. They were known as le portatrici, the women who carried food up to the Alps to give to the men who were fighting at the front. And when I began visiting that region in the 1970s, when there was an earthquake in 1976, I spent a lot of time there, and I met old women who had been in the First World War, which was then 60 years before. And they taught me how to preserve food in ice, how to keep blueberries, which they knew even then, now scientists all agree, are wonderful for the eyes. They're full of antioxidants. These women didn't know what an antioxidant was, but they knew that they were good for the health and good for the eyes. and so that they would preserve blueberries throughout the year. Whereas in other parts of Italy, they'd be, a few blueberries on ice cream. Not in that part of the world. They understood that if you harvested herbs on the 24th of June, St. John's Day, that the herbs would be at their peak. All this knowledge. Now, their calendars, they couldn't read even then. Italy, 110 years ago, most people were illiterate. Now they have a higher literacy rate in the United States. But at that time, they couldn't read. They knew the saints' calendar, and they knew that you collect. There's another expression, non è vino fino al San Martino. St. Martin is the 16th of November. And people of the tradition knew that the wine would be ready for consumption, or at least would be ready to use on the 16th of November if you made your wine in September. Now, they tended to keep it until spring, but the magical process of vinification happened and was considered done by November 16th. All of that is based on the saints' calendars. And this is the kind of magnificent culture of everyday people that, frankly, so-called foodies just completely miss.
Yeah.
When they go to trendy restaurants. And I'm sorry when in Italy you go and suddenly there's a trendy restaurant where they'll have fancy china and Herbie Hancock, who I love, but Herbie Hancock playing on the music when you don't want music at all, where they try to be pretentious to fulfill a Michelin ideal. Michelin is great for France. I use it in France. It's no guideline for Italy because the food culture in Italy is different from France, neither better nor worse. I'm not one of those people who gauges in competition. My initial wine training was actually French wine, so I'm with France. I love France.
No, I mean, your approach is you clearly respect everything where it is and recognize each thing on its own and not in comparison, which I think is.
But also, we have to honor these things, and I don't mean in a formal way like go out and buy everything that there is, but understand that this is not simply a consumer product. And, the Italians, whom I adore, when they, quote, market their products, except for the Tuscans, and you and I can get into this, the Tuscans have figured everything out in this regard, but except for the Tuscans, the Italians will have a brochure talking about passion and tradition, and they mean that, but passion and tradition doesn't translate properly into English in terms of understanding how deep is the passion and how deep is the tradition. I think I was a pretty passionate New Yorker, but I met my match in Italy and embraced it completely because it's so wonderful, but also it needs people to protect it from marketing and commercialization. Go to Italy and discover them and love them for what they know rather than what we want them to be.
Well, let's wrap it up on the coast. As you said, we've got to talk about Liguria. So what is your personal history with that region?
Okay. So I love the whole country, but somehow my image in my head as a little kid of Italy was the Italian Riviera, which I had not even seen images of. My first major interest was Venice. I studied the art of Michelangelo in Tuscany, the Roman Empire, all that stuff. But in my head, Liguria, the Italian Riviera, was really the place. Now, it's 243 kilometers or miles, I always forget, but it's 243 between where it touches Tuscany on one side and where it touches the French Riviera on the other. And it's like a boomerang. And it hugs to the coast. At its deepest point, it's only 15 miles in from the coast. And yet you can be completely mountainous in 15 miles because there's so little arable land, unlike, say, Emilia-Romagna or Lombardy or Sicily or Puglia. The cuisine had to evolve as a dialogue between land and sea. So you don't really have beef and pork there because there's no land to grow those animals. You may have a little bit of chicken or rabbits. You may have fish. You may have glorious fruit and vegetables that grow there because the mountains reflect the sunlight. The sea air blows in and creates, that's where the salt comes from. You can go to a town called Badalucco in the western part of the region where magnificent olive oil is produced on a single olive. Most olive oils are blends of different olives, the way many wines are blends of different grapes. This is one olive, the Tajaska olive, and the way it tastes different is when it's grown in lower altitudes, it's saltier, not that it's salty, but it has a little hint of salt from the sea. Whereas as you get higher, it becomes sweeter. Nothing is changing about the olive. It's only about where it's planted and how it relates to the sea and to the sun. The people have had to be incredibly resourceful because they didn't have abundant resources the way other regions did. So the creativity that was required in the little town where I have lived for a long time, we still have an ancient oven that's not used, but it goes back many centuries to a time when people didn't have any ovens in their home, and many, I don't in the apartment I use. We would take out our doughs that we would make to a bakery or to the oven, and how do you know it's yours? You take your house key and you imprint it in the dough, and then it's baked. You give a little bit of money to the baker, the person running it, and then you claim your bread by putting your key back into it. This kind of resourcefulness, frugality, they're famously frugal, cheap, whatever you want to call it, but it's just ingrained there because there has been so much poverty in a place that happens to be, to me, if Adam and Eve showed up now, they'd say, oh, we're in the Garden of Eden in certain parts of the earth. It's absolutely gorgeous. It was my dream of Italy. And it's not the region that has the most artworks, though Genoa does. It's not the region that has the best sports teams it used to. It's none of that. If you're looking for big fashion shows, forget it. There are a couple of beautiful ports, and where tourism has been, to me, overdeveloped, we try to avoid those places and prevent our towns from becoming that. It is, in a way, the place where elderly people from northern Italy go to get sunshine in the winter. Giuseppe Verdi lived in cold climates, but he spent 40 winters in Genoa. Genoa being a republic, as in Republican city, meaning it was an independent seafaring republic. The first crusade was launched from there. Where the Venetian Empire went and conquered places in the east, the Genoese didn't conquer, they traded. And therefore the relationship was different. They discovered walnuts and use of walnuts in Constantinople, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and brought the walnut making back to Italy, so that one of my favorite pasta sauces is a walnut sauce that goes on a pasta called panzotti, which is dialect. These are ravioli that are pot-bellied ravioli, filled just with herbs that they gather because the herbs are free. One of the greatest dishes in the world is focaccia, which is from Liguria, but focaccia called formaggio. And my mouth is watering as I speak, so if I slur, forgive me. But it's from a town called Recco.
He's already jumping to the wine, everybody. I can see the wine episode.
And Recco is an unremarkable town to look at because most of it was destroyed in World War II. And but the people of Recco decided that if we have nothing tangible from our past to look at, except for one church, we're going to maintain our food traditions because that tells us who we are. That gives us our identity. And one of the most famous dishes was simply flour. Originally, it might have been chestnut flour, a very soft cow's milk cheese. It was once goat milk, a little bit of olive oil and water and a little bit of salt. And they would bake it in outdoor ovens to a very high temperature. So it's not chewy bread. There was no yeast. Yeast was too expensive. So it's kind of like a crepe. It's like a grilled cheese sandwich extraordinaire with just all these flavors combining. The simplest of food. It's my last supper. I know that if I get to pick my last supper, one of the courses will be focaccia col formaggio.
No, I noticed the caveat in there. One of the courses.
Yeah, of course.
It's going to be a long dinner.
Pesto is from Liguria.
Yes,
Now,
pesto. I wanted to dig into because one of the pieces that jumped out to me in your description of Liguria in the book is how simple the pesto is. I think pestos today, especially in America, some of those recipes can run to 10 ingredients.
They're abominations. That's not pesto.
Right.
Pesto means it comes from the action of pounding a pestle in a mortar and what you pound in there. Now, you can use a mortar and pestle in India, for example, to grind spices. And I'm not saying that a mortar and pestle is only to make pesto, but in Liguria, the traditional sauce, and they have a competition every spring in Genoa and in Recco that is one of the most magnificent things because it's recalling of the culture where people in the region will compete to make the best pesto only by hand. And in my book, Recipes from Paradise, Life and Food on the Italian Riviera, I have 16 recipes for pesto, not to get frou-frou, but really because the variations that you find from town to town are notable and are genuine. 15 of the 16 are done by hand. I recognize that there are people who, for whatever reason, cannot make something in their hand if they have arthritis or for whatever reason. So I have one blender pesto that kind of approximates it, but it's not the same thing because the heat of the blades and the metal of the blades corrupts not only the oil, but the basil and everything else. So it's not quite the same, but if you cannot make something by hand, I do have pesto al frullatore, blender pesto for you. But basically, you want to gather fresh basil, Basilico di Pra. There's a little town, not even a town, just within the walls of Genoa, where there's air pollution there. I don't understand it, but somehow the most magnificent basil comes from right there. One of the reasons I was fascinated with Liguria was when I was an impressionable little kid, and I was reading about basil and pesto. It was noted to me that women would place sprigs of basil in their bosom to attract men. You know, residual perfume or winking of the eye. No, you get a guy in Liguria by putting a little bit of basil there.
That's a pretty appealing idea.
And
actually.
similarly, to go back to focaccia, in the town where I like to spend a lot of time, they invented onion focaccia. And why is that? Because when the men were seafarers, they go to sea, their wives or women would bake onion focaccia for them. Why is that? So they would have oniony breasts. So when they got to another town and would meet a woman that they may want to be with, apparently that onion breath was a deterrent. But how do you answer that? You eat onion focaccia throughout the region, and we all have onion breath.
That's terrific.
I'm not kidding. I'm really not kidding.
Yeah,
I want you to understand. I'm not being a stand-up comedian. This is what they do.
Everything
Liguria,
as you say, everything has a reason.
Liguria has the lowest divorce rate of any region in Italy, not because they're better at marriage, but because they don't want to spend on lawyers. So in the past, people would sort of live apart and have arrangements. But now, in certain ways, they marry later. There's a lower birth rate. They marry later, and they marry someone that they really want to be with. And so even love is different in Liguria. It's just everything about that region, to me, suits me. And I'm not saying it suits everyone. And again, it's not just the food or the environment. It's the whole reality of the region, plus the beauty. But other people can look at Tuscany and say, as it is, magnificently beautiful. Lazio, where Rome is, Campania, Sicily, the whole nation is gorgeous. And, you know, I don't deny anyone's right to prefer one of the other 19 regions. I love all 20, and I'm happy in all 20. I feel at home in Liguria. That's the difference.
Well, Fred, this has been a great conversation. You have my mouth watering on this one as well. And so I'd love, it sounds like you're willing to come back next time. I want to dig into the coffee culture, espresso culture. hear more about the wines. And we have yet to talk about working with friend of the pod, Rick Steves.
Yes.
So
My friend Rick.
Exactly. And my friend too, the friend of all of our listeners here at Out of Office. So until then, thank you so much. And now it's time for the last stop.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train.
All right. Well, as ever, many thanks to Fred Plotkin. And don't worry, he's going to be back real soon. But Ryan, here we are in the last stop. This is my favorite segment of the show, your favorite segment. It's popularly known as the People segment. And that's because it's where we come together to share. We can share anything. It can be a memory, a plan. It can be a piece of gear. Could be an article. It could be a podcast. Could be a book. But it does have to meet one criterion, which is that it must inspire the spirit of wanderlust within us, even during the workday week. So, Ryan, I want to ask you, as I asked you every episode, do you have a last stop this week?
I do, Kiernan. My last stop is this great article that was in the Atlantic last week, link in the show notes, by a guy named Gary Shteyngart. And he spent 7 nights on board the brand new Icon of the Seas. And the Icon of the Seas is this new mega cruise ship. It's the biggest cruise ship of all time. In fact, it's one of the biggest ships ever. He interviews in the article a gentleman who was a captain of a U.S. Like a U.S. destroyer or an aircraft carrier, some massive U.S. naval ship. And he said that he wouldn't know what to do with a ship of that size. So it's a big boat, and it's controversial, because the cruising is controversial to begin with. But now we've got this ship that holds an incredible amount of people, and when they go to these port cities, and he talks about how they only so many port cities will let a cruise ship of this size dock there. And, the environmental impact, et cetera. He goes into a lot of that, but it's mostly sort of a day-to-day travel log of his time on the boat. It's very funny. I have to say that Gary is not a fan of cruises to begin with. So obviously his perspective on this is different than somebody who, enjoys cruises as a pastime. And there are many of those folks. Obviously it's a big industry, but, just really some really funny details, like all the different status that you get, and you can have access to different rooms if you're a member of, basically the Admirals Club. You've been on enough cruises, and they booked the tickets for him too late, so he couldn't get an ocean view. So he had a view of the mall, which sounds to me like hell, but to each his own. It might be
Full disclosure here, Ryan, is that I'm actually close to a member of the board of Royal Caribbean. And I actually had the chance to spend an evening when one of these ships was docked in New Jersey, and they invite friends and family to come on and kind of kick the tires of what it was like. And I do have to say it wasn't to my tastes, but I can also understand why, if you were traveling as a family, it has its appeal, where everything you need, the restaurants, the theater, the pool, I did like one of those wind tunnel things where you put on a thing and you fly like a giant fan, it had its appeal. It's just the sheer size of it kind of freaked me out, because you could forget you were on the ocean.
Yeah, he talks about the childcare aspect of it as being sort of subsidized childcare. So they have, on all these boats, they have, basically kid centers where you can drop your kids off for the day, and they can spend time while you go, drinking on the drinking in one of the many bar pools. This cruise ship has the biggest bar pool of any ship in the world. So, that's something. But yeah, I've been on one cruise, a Norwegian cruise, the Rosie O'Donnell cruise. My then boyfriend at the time was a performer on this cruise, a short version of Chicago. Chicago needs to be 45 minutes. It's just too long.
Oh, stop. Chicago is one of the great
So yeah, it's not my cup of tea. I did get a lot of reading done on that trip, but I will link in the show notes. It's very funny. I would love to get Gary on to get his his firsthand impressions, ask him some questions. He was a writer on secession. And when he would mention that on the cruise ship, nobody knew what secession was, which is pretty funty.
I like that he was walking around trying to mention it to a bunch of people.
He really was, actually. That seems like part of his.
This reminds me of Connor Roy. Anybody Connor Roy? Nobody. That's not ringing a bell.
Yeah. So it's quite a funny piece, and I understand why it went viral, and it's definitely a long read, and it's worth your time if you're interested in, what this experience is like. I think, especially if you've never been on a cruise ship before, mine was only like a 3-day cruise, and it was like a normal sized ship. This is like an epic 7-day adventure, and I think our listeners will enjoy it. So the link in the show notes to that. And Kiernan, did you bring a last stop this week?
I did indeed. I took inspiration from yours of interesting articles and content from others' travels. And this one caught my eye. It's a national park story. We haven't talked about the national parks too much lately. And this is a CNN story about a 94-year-old grandmother and her grandson who have gone on a great tour to visit all 63 national parks. Before she was 91, she never had a passport. And her grandson, who's in his 40s, decided, he was in veterinarian school and decided just kind of by chance to ask if she would want to go to a national park with him. And this has developed into a full-time gig where they are traveling all 63 national parks. And now they are committed, she's 94, to visiting all the continents, all 7 continents. So, talk about a ticking clock, which to make a narrative very exciting. But no, it's very sweet. It's interesting. And the article gets into their personal relationship. And I guess there was a divorce in the family and they were estranged for a little while. And like now they're coming back together. And what I really appreciated about it was that Brad, the grandson, was reflecting on how it changes travel for him by traveling with somebody in their 90s, that it makes him go slower and appreciate more details. And this is a place that's not exclusively called out here, but we've praised the national parks for this before, which is so many of the national parks do make themselves available for all abilities and ages. And I really love that. I mean, I'm fascinated that they were able to go to all 63 because you've got some really adventure parks where you're off the beaten path. But, many of the main, besides the most obscure, the furthest into Alaska or like the Northern Cascades, besides those more adventure parks, all ages and abilities, very family friendly. But I definitely want to go back and look through the At Grandma Joy's Road Trip catalog.
Well, I love this story because it's never too late to travel, and if you can, just go a few hours from your house, you can explore something that's new and unique and interesting. And the fact that she was able to go to all those national parks and is going to do the big continent tour, which is more than you and I have done.
We've got. I mean, I haven't gone to Antarctica. Otherwise, I'm doing okay.
I think otherwise I'm doing okay too.
Yeah. Australia is also. I have not. Have you been to Australia?
No. Is that a continent?
Oh, that's a cat. I remember when I was in school, Oceania was the name of that continent. What are the 7 continents? That does feel like we need to say. Okay, Africa, I've got that. Antarctica, no. Asia, yes. Australia, no. Europe, North America, South America, yeah. So I think we have the same gap. So doing pretty well. But Antarctica and Australia's low on my list. I have that earmarked for like a later trip when the children are like teenagers. I feel like it'll be like easy, long. They can just disappear into their computers and iPads or, whatever we're using at that future time. And, be very familiar when you get off the plane.
The Apple Vision Pro, I think, is what you'll be using.
Where it's just implanted directly into your eyeballs. Well, Ryan, one thing that's on my mind that I just want to wrap up on is you and I are considering doing an episode where we talk about the travel for concerts and musical performances. This, of course, spurred by the many, many thought pieces and news articles about how Taylor Swift, Beyonce, these like massive superstars, encourage people to travel, bring people to places they wouldn't have usually gone. They're traveling just for that concert and the impact it has on the economy. I have to say, I want to know whether our listeners are interested in that. So what I'm going to ask is, if you want to hear that interview, if you want to hear us bring on an expert to talk about the impact that a Taylor Swift and Beyonce, these like massive superstars, have on travel, just shoot us a line at outofofficepod@gmail.com. outofofficepod@gmail.com.
And you can always slide into our DMs at
you got to slip right in
podcast.
Exactly.
Have you ever traveled for a concert?
No, but I'm not a big concert goer. I've traveled for musical performances, for musical theater, but I have not traveled for a concert. I'm just not a big concert goer.
I have done two specific trips for concerts. One to see Paul McCartney in Portland, Oregon, and one to take my mom to Adele in Mexico City.
Oh, wow. Those are pretty, those both sound pretty special.
They were both awesome. Yeah. So I think traveling for concerts would be interesting. So folks, back me up, email or DM, and, maybe we'll get somebody on to talk about that. But until then, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
The seat taken.
Can we go on a cruise together, Kiernan, for our next travel adventure?
I'd go. You know what looks nice to me? I remember before Downton Abbey, they used to have all those Viking cruise commercials. Those look pretty nice. They go in the rivers in Europe. That sounds romantic.
It does. It'd be like Bert and Ernie on a cruise.
Oh, God.